All right. I think we're going to get going here in just a second. I apologize if my sound quality isn't that great. I am not able to get my headset to work today. All right, we're going to go ahead and get going. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 4th of 8 symposium webinars hosted by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Center for Energy and Power. My name is Gwen Holdman. I am a senior researcher with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I will be your moderator for today. The purpose of these sessions is to present topic-specific information for the Alaska Energy Security Task Force as they work to develop a statewide energy plan. If you've missed the first 3 webinars, the recordings are available via the task force website. Today's presentation is going to be focused on hydropower, titled the Railbelt Hydropower Development and Financing, Lessons Learned from the Past and Opportunities from the Future. And I am hosting this website here from the Trophietta campus here in Fairbanks from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We're going to be joined by Joel Groves, Brian Hickey, Wayne Vyuk, and Brian Carey. And each presentation is going to be allotted a set amount of time, and we will allow for Q&A after each speaker. Please feel free to use the function to drop Q&A into the tab. We're only going to be allowing members of the task force to actually unmute if they raise their hand to verbally ask questions, but anyone in the audience is welcome to add questions in, and we will prioritize task force questions, but we're also going to be pulling questions from the general public if we're able to make time for those. And so today's meeting, it's going to be recorded, and the presentation slide decks along with that recording will be available in the near future on the Alaska Energy Authority website. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right into our first presentation, introducing Joel Groves of Polar Consult with South Central Alaska Small and Medium Hydro Opportunities. Joel's a consulting civil engineer based in Anchorage, and Polar Consult specializes in small hydro with experience in both rural Alaska and on the rail belt. He's also the president of the Alaska Independent Power Association and a director on the board of the Railbelt Reliability Council. Joel, I know that you have a pretty short amount of time to join us, so thank you for making time today. I know you have to jump to another meeting at the top of the hour, and so let's just, with no further ado, just jump right into your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. Yeah, and also thanks to the other presenters today and the Energy Task Force.
And Joel, I think that you're muted if you're speaking.
Let's see. I don't see myself.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not able to hear you.
I'll text Gwen. We can hear you, Joel. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So thanks to everybody for attending today and organizing this. I know that the mission of the Energy Security Task Force and the schedule is pretty profound, so I can kind of appreciate the magnitude of what you're all doing, and am happy to contribute to the educational process that will support your work. Let me see if I can figure out how to share a screen. Should be this one, perhaps.
Yep, we've got you.
Yeah, kind of. Okay, close enough. So I'm Joel Groves, one of the engineers at Polar Consult Alaska, and speaking to small hydropower in South Central today. 4 high-level things I want to talk about. A very brief intro to hydropower. I imagine the committee is probably pretty well versed in it, but I'll touch on that really quickly. Give a history of small hydro in South Central, somewhat focused on independent power producer participation in that industry. Characterize what the resource potential for build out of small hydro in the region might be, and then briefly discuss how we might actually build out that resource potential. Hydropower generally is diverting water out of some resource and sending it downhill, running it through a turbine and generating electricity. So head times flow equals power. So you double the head, you double the flow, either or, you double the power. General numbers. The threshold for what is called small hydro is pretty subjective, not really well defined in the industry. In Alaska, it probably makes sense to put that threshold at about 5 megawatts. In some jurisdictions in the lower 48 and elsewhere around the world, it could be quite a bit higher, more like 50 megawatts, but that's pretty big up here, so we call it 5, but that's a very fuzzy line. And then the two major classes of hydro generally, or storage projects, are run of river. I'll be speaking more to run of river. Distinction there is storage projects is you either have a reservoir created by a dam, or sometimes you have a lake tap or something. So you're exploiting a naturally occurring reservoir that allows you to bank water and run it through the project and generate electricity on demand to follow load curves and so on. Run a river does not have any appreciable storage. So you're taking the instantaneous flow of a creek or river, running it through the powerhouse on an as available basis to generate electricity. So it's more of a use it or lose it resource. If you don't generate electricity from the available water in a creek at any given time, that water goes down the creek and it's lost to that power production opportunity. And most of the stuff I'll be talking about today is run a river. There is some storage potential out there in the smaller scale. So illustrate what this is kind of the Grover from Sesame Street thing, near, far, big, small stuff. These are two examples of storage projects in Alaska. Everyone's probably familiar with Bradley Lake, south of Homer. It's a 120 megawatt storage project, large gravity dam, large reservoir. So that's big storage hydro. The other end of the size spectrum for storage, a good example is Chunasax Creek out in on Atka Islands, serving the village of Atka out in the Aleutians. And that's the lower right picture. You can see the people standing on top of the dam there. That's about a 15-foot tall dam, something like that. That's a 270 kilowatt project that serves the village of Atka. And the reservoir there creates about, I think it's like 2 or 3 weeks of storage. So it provides a little bit of flexibility for utility operations to minimize and optimize diesel runtime. So similarly with run of river projects, example of a big run of river project is Forest Kerr, commissioned in recent years down in British Columbia. It's a 195 megawatt project, so actually larger installed capacity than Bradley Lake. But again, no storage, so this diverts a river and generates all that lovely energy. And then a small run of river hydro project, the newest Railbelt Hydro, is the 300 kilowatt Juniper Creek, privately developed up in the Eagle River Valley, came online in 2021. And again, that's that lower right picture. That's the diversion site. That's the impoundment is a very small creek, smaller than a swimming pool, more like a little kiddie splash pool or something. And so that project, again, just diverts the instantaneous flow of the creek through the project and generates electricity and sells that to the local grid. The specific buyer there is Matanuska Electric Association. So really brief history of hydro in South Central is, as the region electrified in the early 20th century, hydro was a logical choice that was often exploited. And you saw that in the canneries, the mines, and the communities were the general developers of the projects. And this is starting again early 20th century with the era of electrification. Many of the people developing electricity at that time looked around and said hydro is the logical answer, and they developed those resources. Some of those projects throughout the state are still in operation. Many of them are defunct. Like in South Central, a lot of those early projects are defunct. The original Eklutna River project, the dam of which was removed a few years back now by Eklutna Inc. and a number of other partners. That was I believe, a roughly 2 megawatt project that was installed by some of the business interests in Anchorage back in the 1920s to provide electricity to early Anchorage. There were a number of, most of the mines, for example, up in Hatcher Pass actually had small hydros running the stamp mills back in the day. Those specific to Hatcher Pass, at least, are all derelict today, abandoned and largely forgotten. And then many of the communities in the region also exploited hydro. Seward had hydro, Valdez had hydro back in the day. Actually, the existing Solomon Gulch project had a predecessor private project on that resource that was supplanted and upgraded by the current facility there. So there's a rich history of small hydro in the region, and of course that resource continues to exist today. More more recently, and more specific to independent power producer participation in the market in South Central, there are 3 projects that have been developed over the years. Pardon me. The first of those was commissioned in 1991, the same year that Bradley Lake came online. And that was a 100 kilowatt project in the mountains behind Palmer on McRoberts Creek. That originally produced power at the same rate that Bradley did. 4 cents a kilowatt hour was the original contract term with Madanuska Electric Association. And it's worth noting that that project didn't have any government subsidies like Bradley did to bring the price down to that level. There were, I think, if you look at it impartially, I think there were a lot of implicit private side subsidies. The developer put a lot of sweat equity and so on into the project, but there were no government subsidies that brought that price down. Moving forward in 2013, there was a 1.1 megawatt project constructed on the South Fork of Eagle River, up Highland Road. That project sells power to MEA at a fixed price of 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And then the one that you already saw a picture of in 2021, the 300 kilowatt Juniper Creek project came online. That also sells power to MEA. And they sell power at MEA's tariffed quarterly avoided cost, which varies quarter by quarter based on their reported fuel and O&M costs and so on. And in recent years has been around between 7 and 8 cents a kilowatt hour. So that is the sum total of small IPP projects currently operational on the rail belt. And I should note McRoberts Creek is not currently operational. It is defunct right now. The owners of that passed away, and it's stuck in probate with the courts. But the resource is still there and the assets and so on. So what these projects all have in common that are interesting for the mission of the task force is none of them received government subsidies. These were all private sector developments. They have a short lead time, and I in all honesty, I provide the range there. So McRoberts Creek and Juniper Creek, from the investment decision to commissioning, took place over 2 or 3 years. South Fork is an interesting story. So it's located on a homestead, and the homestead was actually selected by the family back in the 1950s because there was a hydro site there. And it took them from the 1950s to 2013 to actually navigate the various intricacies of commercial financing and power sales contracts and all the rest to get that project developed. So that one had a 50-year give or take lead time. But when things align, these projects can happen very fast from that investment decision to completion and being operational. All of these projects also have a unique or a common thread that they're all happen because of very unique circumstances. All 3 of these projects were developed by highly people with unique skill sets that also happen to have unique property holdings or the ability to move these projects forward. At this point in time, this business model is not really commercially replicable, and that's why we don't see more than these 3 projects on the grid today. There are interests like myself who are interested in seeing this become a commercially viable sector in the electric industry. But where we're at today, it's not quite there. It's really close, I think. So this is a really intriguing potential. If we can unlock sort of this commercial business model, I think we could see this sector really expand and be an important contributor in the overall rail belt story as regards electricity. So key takeaways here. Is old hydro is the cheapest power there is. There's a recent op-ed that came out in the Anchorage Daily News around the Eklutna project that, among other things, I was really pleased to see that it disclosed to the public in a way that hasn't really been done before that Eklutna is actually the cheapest power on the rail belt at less than a penny a kilowatt hour. It's often said that Bradley Lake is the cheapest power on the rail belt, but Bradley is still a relatively young hydro project, and it's at 4 cents a kilowatt hour with the government subsidies and so on. Whereas Eklutna commissioned in 1955, the capital debt's been retired, so that thing's cheap. And that's the universal story of hydro is once they're extremely capital intensive projects. So year 1, they're typically very expensive, but once that initial capital debt is retired, they are you can't touch them. They're the cheapest power that you can get. Then the other key takeaway here is that a small hydro developed by independent power producers, from my perspective, is on the cusp of commercial viability. If the revenue potential of the projects gets a little bit better, and maybe it's there with some of the government subsidies that are out from the federal side right now, I think this business model could really take off, and we could see a lot of development in the future years that we haven't seen to date. So to pivot really quickly here, so we've got 1.5 megawatts of IPP small hydro on the Railbelt grid today. And so how much are we really talking about? This map shows the existing hydro projects on the Railbelt grid. And the little blue areas are crude representations of the basin areas that contribute to each project. So moving south to north, and this is big utility projects and small IPP projects as well. As I said, south, and it's really east of Homer, because Catchback Bay doesn't actually orient like I think it does in my head. So east of Homer, you've got Bradley Lake and also the Battle Creek diversion, cumulative 120 megawatt capacity storage project that was commissioned in 1991 with the Battle Creek diversion coming online in 2020. Moving north, you've got Cooper Lake, commissioned in 1961, storage project, 19.4 megawatts of capacity. That one's owned by Chugach Electric. And then, of course, Eklutna Lake, developed in 1955, the so-called new Eklutna project. 40 megawatts of storage. It's a lake tap. There's actually a tunnel that pops up into the bottom of the lake bed. And that one is 40 megawatts, owned jointly by the city of Anchorage, Chugach, and Madanuska Electric Association. Then moving into the IPP side, the three that I mentioned, McRoberts Creek up behind Palmer, and then Juniper Creek and the South Fork Eagle River up Eagle River Valley. And just for GWIZ, I've also got the Solomon Gulch and Allison Creek over on the Copper Valley side, also in South Central, but not grid connected. And I suppose if I was really special, I would even have the ones in Cordova and so on, but I didn't get that far. So that's the resource as it exists today, what's actually been built and by and large operational. If we look at some of the projects that have been or are being talked about, and again, this is comprehensive, large and small hydro. Again, starting in the south, you've got Dixon Fork. I think we'll probably be hearing about that from some of the other presenters today. So I'm not sure what that 60 megawatt Runner River, what the current status of that resource investigation is. That would either be a standalone Runner River project on the Dixon Fork of Martin River or another basin transfer over to the Bradley Lake project. And I think some upgrades have been proposed there to basically put more fuel in the gas tank of the Bradley system. Over in Seward, there's a couple of projects across the bay from downtown Seward up behind the prison, both on 4th of July Creek. One is the 4th of July Creek branch of 4th of July Creek. So if you're looking up the valley from the prison or something like that, it's the one on the right-hand side. That's about a 5 megawatt run-of-river project. You could build a dam up there and maybe get some storage out of it. And then on the other side, so the left-hand side of that basin is the Godwin project, which is interesting. When I started looking at 4th of July back in 2008, the Godwin Fork was basically under a glacier, so it didn't receive any further review from me. But since then, the glacier has disappeared. There's a nice perched lake up there in the Alpine. And Chugach is currently investigating that project, looking at, I'm not sure what the proposed capacity is there, but something on the order of 5 to 20 megawatts, depending on the hydrology and the resource particulars. Moving north of that, up the Seward Highway towards Anchorage, you've got the Snow River. There's probably about a 75 megawatt storage project there. I don't think that one's politically viable. The river is nominated for wild and scenic status by the federal government, and I think there's enough political and environmental barriers to that one that it'll probably never happen. Just north of that is Grant Lake. That project has a FERC license and is being considered pretty actively by Homer Electric. That would be a 5 megawatt storage project. And then continuing north, there's a bunch of small hydro resources, predominantly run-of-river in the Whittier area, totaling something on the order of 2 megawatts. Similar story in Girdwood. There's plus or minus 2 megawatts of run-of-river potential up in the Girdwood Valley around Alyeska Resort and so on. There's a lot of potential in the front range of the Chugach behind Anchorage. It's all in the state park and or the J Bear footprint, but every single one of the little basins behind Anchorage, all those little mountain creeks are 1 or 2 megawatts each, run a river, that are interesting potential future projects. Over on the west side of the inlet, you've got Chakachamna Lake that was being developed about 15 or being considered about 15 years ago by TDX, the village corporation out on St. Paul Island. And that was conceived as a 330 megawatt storage project. I think that one is not currently being pursued. Continuing around, as you head up the Connect River Valley, you've got Hunter Creek. That's the East Fork of Hunter Creek, has been studied as a potential 7.8 megawatt run-of-river resource. There's additional resource potential in the West Fork of Hunter Creek, similar size, more economic challenges there. It's farther away from existing infrastructure, and it's also partially within the Chugach State Park in a wilderness area, so there's some political barriers there. Another interesting one is Glacier Fork of the Connect River, that large yellow area. That was conceived of as a 75 megawatt storage project about 15 years ago. And that's an interesting story. That project is no longer, I guess, as viable or viable at all. Since that project was identified, that tributary was pinned to the side of the valley by the Connect Glacier, the main lobe of Connect Glacier, and had carved a pretty substantial canyon down to get onto the head of the Connect River Flats. Since that was probably like 2012 or so when that project was first conceived, the glacier mass has receded sufficiently that the main valley of the Connect River has captured that tributary. It no longer flows through that canyon and is now flowing under the glacier and onto the main valley, underneath the glacier onto the main valley floor. So there's basically been a natural basin transfer by merit of glacial retreat that's happened there. That's either made that project non-viable or significantly increased the cost. You'd have to put that river back where it once was to make that project go. So pretty remarkable sort of geologic timescale changes that have happened in the past decade on that one. And then just to really quickly round out the resource portfolio, there's a number of projects in Hatcher Pass, north of Palmer. One of those is a project I've been developing for the past 17 years, or trying to develop for the past 17 years, the 2 megawatt run-of-river Fishhook Creek project up there. And there's a number of other resource potential projects in Hatcher Pass, both on the east side where Fishhook would be located and also on the west side as well. There's a bunch of resource potential there. So this is just a representative sampling of some of the resources that have received scrutiny. Practically, if you wanted to sort of paint the resource potential for the region, the whole thing could be yellow. And then you have to look at the environmental, technical, economic, political viability of each one of those little basins. But the resource potential is profound. And when we look at that, and this is kind of a speculative pie in the sky number that I think is probably conservative, we can call it probably a 100 megawatt installed capacity build out for the region for South Central Alaska that could get tied onto the grid. And this is what that would look like on a run-of-river basis. This graphic is an annual hydrograph, sort of a generalized annual hydrograph of the water availability. So through the summer months, that big flat line starting in May, running through October, is the creek flow or river flow exceeds the installed capacity of the hydro project. And this is all on a generalized basis. So you're running at full output through the summer months, basically from the onset of breakup through the onset of freeze up in the fall. Once things do freeze up, you basically lose your surface discharge and you enter a groundwater discharge regime that endures through the winter months. And so you see this nice recession curve that starts in October and runs with ever diminishing flow to April, mid-April, depending on where you are, maybe into May, where that's curtailed by the start of breakup and the return of surface runoff. So this is a pretty typical hydrograph that you can see almost anywhere in South Central. You can see in extreme drought years, that firm capacity up at the top can be curtailed by low flows once the snowpack is gone. In the fall season, you'll see fall storms that will bump that graph up a little bit when you get a peak discharge from a fall storm. And then Chinooks through the winter months or the freeze thaw cycles that we see sometimes can produce little bumps through the winter section, but those are all kind of stochastic weather dependent events. Of that 100 megawatt capacity that I'm talking about, you'd see about 20 to 25% firm capacity coincident with the annual peaks of the utilities, typically occurring in December, January timeframe. And you'd see about a 13 megawatt firm minimum annual capacity right at the tail end of winter, just before breakup. That'd be your minimum annual flow, your minimum firm output of these projects. So the bottom line here is this is at that 100 megawatt hypothetical capacity. This is about 438,000 megawatt hours of annual energy output. Seasonally, it's timed as you see here on the graph. And for context, the existing Bradley Lake, and I think this predated the first of the diversion projects that came in, is about 423,000 megawatt hours. So this resource is about equal to Bradley Lake. And all existing Railbelt Hydro is about 620,000 megawatt hours. And that's something like 8 to 10% of total Railbelt annual energy demand that this technology and this resource could offer. Again, I think ultimately that's probably that 100 megawatt number is probably a conservative number, but it's so far down the road that let's start down that journey and then fine tune it as we go. So really briefly, some of the so this would of course not be a single project. This would be something on the order of 20, 40, 60 individual projects that could all advance independently of each other. And there's a lot of neat sort of ancillary non-utility benefits to these. These are all little projects out at the end of the distribution system up in the mountains. So each one of them provides opportunity for recreational enhancements, the project access trails and so on, depending on the land status and public policy and whatnot, have the opportunity to become new hardened hiking trails to improve access up into the backcountry. I think that's pretty cool. Because of the distributed nature of these out on the distal radial ends of the distribution system, they actually provide some distribution level grid resiliency benefits. You can have voltage support out there depending on how the project's configured and incentivized, and other sort of grid support functions. You can actually improve the efficiency of the distribution system. Instead of energy coming out from one of the major generating plants, that local load is being served by the hydro, and so you actually improve the efficiency of the overall distribution system. So there's a lot of sort of small ancillary benefits to these projects that are kind of cool. So the big question here is, okay, there's some energy coming from some stuff. What might it cost? So there's not a whole lot of data. Hydro is expensive. Hydro has a notorious reputation, especially in Alaska, for coming in way over budget. Something that my industry, in the engineering world, kind of looks at with a lot of regret, because over budget projects don't really help anybody. But so this is some of the cost data of recent projects. Orange are those done by utilities, blue done by IPPs. And, so 10,000 a kilowatt hour is a reasonable estimate at a 2,000 kilowatt capacity, project by project. There's some evidence that maybe you could hit 5,000 down in the IPP world, and that would be really cool. So the bottom line of this is you put all that together, $500 million to $1 billion capex over the build out period of this would be many years, probably a couple decades. 40 to 60 individual projects. They could happen independently of each other. They could happen very quickly. The project attributes, as I spoke to earlier there, in terms of overall energy performance and so on. And so again, this is 1.5 megawatts. The history that we have to date is 1.5 megawatts that have been developed in the past 30 years. And, that's kind of a footnote, if even that. It's a very, very small contribution to the overall energy picture in the region. And so I think that there's two barriers. As I said, this isn't quite commercially viable. There hasn't been a robust business model that's been unlocked for this industry and this opportunity yet. And so there's two key things that I see that would help do that. So one of those is regulatory reform to streamline and speed up the permitting process for these projects. And that's, most of these are not federal projects. These are state projects. So these are state permitting processes that are impeding these projects. And then also market reform, getting the revenue side aligned with the true benefit of the project, so that they can receive the revenue that they need to make that investment decision for developers. And with that, I will stop talking and entertain any questions.
All right. Thank you, Joel. And I know that you've just really got like maybe 30 seconds or something left with us. I really appreciate your time with this presentation. I am kind of curious, like, how do you see federal, some of the federal tax credits and federal opportunities sort of interplaying with the economics of these small hydro projects?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I did actually push off my 11:30 conflict. So I do have a 10-minute Q&A window here. But yeah, so it's an open question. So there's been some profound, federal subsidies that have come out through the BIL and the EIA, or whatever the various federal programs that came out over the past couple of years. I don't think that the industry has fully characterized how those will benefit IPP hydro development yet. I think that there's a potential for it to be profound. The tax credits, some of the outright grant programs that are out there, many of those have just been hitting the street with the application process this summer. So I don't think that the private sector is fully aware of how that will impact it yet. But I think specific to hydro, but I think it's profound. Some of the tax credits are 30%, 50% tax credits, depending on which hoops you jump through. And I think that is a big enough potential incentive that you could push a lot of these projects sort of over that edge into economic viability, to the extent that those tax credits and other programs are really bankable, where you can count on those. So I think it's an open question. It's a very intriguing question. And when you look at the distributed risk, the potential relatively fast development horizon on these projects, and how close they are to that sort of commercially viable business model, it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I really appreciate it. I want to remind everybody, if you're a member of the task force, please go ahead and raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask a question. Otherwise, please drop your question into the Q&A feature and we can address those from that queue. So Joel, you mentioned that a lot of these, that some of these permits are sort of hung up at the state level. I think people might be a little bit surprised to hear that, because we often kind of think about this as like a lot of federal permitting, but it sounds like a lot of these projects are on state lands, or that we're looking at sort of a state process, that there's the potential for streamlining. Is that so? Does that sound correct? I mean, you stated that, I suppose. So
yeah, it does. So it is kind of counterintuitive. So when my partners and I, like I mentioned during the presentation, we have this project we were pursuing up in Fisher Creek up in Hatcher Pass. We identified that resource, after the first gas crisis in the early 2000s in the Cook Inlet Basin, looking at the increasing cost of avoided energy on the rail belt and so on. That project would be located on state land. So we needed to get land leases and easements from DNR and the Department of Natural Resources. So we did our due diligence on the project and put in our applications in 2006. We have still not received, after 17 years, a decision on those lease and easement applications, which is pretty extraordinary, to have almost 2 decades go by with inaction from the state. When we first started that business plan, we specifically targeted resources that are not on federal land and are not under FERC jurisdiction, thinking that the state permitting process would be far better than the FERC licensing process. As it turns out, in our experience, FERC would have been awesome. It's long, arduous, and expensive, but typically, if you're diligent about pursuing it, you can get it done in $500,000 in a 5-year process. Is a pretty conservative expectation for one of these small projects if you're clever about it. As it is, we're 17 years into this one with no action yet. So that is a pretty sad story that merits redress. We're still working with DNR on the project. The 3 of the 5 original investors are still interested in seeing the project happen today, but so much time has gone by. All of the original assumptions are invalid. Your economics change, costs change, everything changes. So it's a story on what not to do and what should never happen. But there it is.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joel. And Tony, you've dropped a couple of comments and questions in here. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, I think one of Tony's questions or comments is really along the lines of how fair is it really to compare this list to a Bradley Lake where you've got storage hydro that is at least theoretically available year round versus run of river where you do have these fluctuations like you're talking about, where you've got that shift to primarily like groundwater fed, during the winter months. Do you want to comment on that? And Tony, you can feel free to unmute and chime in as well. So, but go ahead, Joel.
Yeah. So just looking at the questions here to make sure I understand them. Yeah. So I think when you talk about, let's see, to go to the first one, how is it fair to compare this list to a Bradley Lake? Yeah. So these are predominantly run-of-river projects, and so they do have that seasonally variable output, like I said, whereas Bradley has storage, and I think is at or close to fully regulated storage where you can dispatch that energy as needed throughout the year. Yeah, that is absolutely a very different technology. You need to understand, what the output potential of a run-of-river is. It does have that seasonally variable firm output, and you have to, put that into the economics of your resource portfolio and make an informed decision. So they are not apples to apples. It is an apples to pears comparison, I guess. I mean, it's not as stochastic as wind or solar or things like that, where on any given day, the wind may or may not blow, the sky may or may not be clear, and so on. But nonetheless, it is. I'm trying to bring the questions back up here while I talk. It does have an app. It is plannable, dispatchable, predictable, with that seasonal variable. Where's everything going? Component to it. And I'm sorry, I'm trying. What does this thing do? Trying to pull up the questions. Okay, I'm going to switch to my other computer.
Joel, I'm happy to help you out with that. There's a little bit of back and forth around Bradley Lake here and to what extent the state was involved in funding or financing that project, which I'm actually hoping that Brian Hickey or Brian Carey will be able to address later. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best use of your time. The other thing in here for you though is like, do you see that there's any existing legislation, whether that would or planned legislation or discussed legislation like an RPS or a clean energy standard or a green bank that could have a material impact on expanding small hydro from a state standpoint, in addition to the permitting?
Yeah, so I think if the revenue stream for these projects is sufficient, then private sector financing or some of the public sector programs like the Power Project Fund are sufficient for it. Things like green banks and stuff can only help that, and I think those are important as well. Yeah, and I'm sorry, was there another aspect to that question that fell out of my head?
No, I don't think so. I think the committee's just really trying to look at opportunities for sort of, creating an opportunity space for various kinds of technologies. So understanding from a policy standpoint, as well as like the permitting standpoint, how to kind of facilitate development in these projects is of interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yes. The other part of that fell out of my head momentarily was the RPS. I think that could be a significant contributor. It would really depend on what the final legislation looked like and how that was structured and how it would potentially benefit these projects or IPPs generally. And so, I mean, this resource potential is something that could be developed equally well by IPPs or the utilities themselves. And we see some of that. That Godwin project is an example of utility pursuit. As is Grant Lake as well. So, the resource doesn't care who develops it, and it, it's there for general benefit. The other thing that existing legislation that hasn't really had an impact, in spite of I think what it was intended to, was the state energy policy that was passed under the Palin administration. That proved to be very aspirational. The 50% renewable energy by 2025 target has proved to have no teeth. So when you're actually dealing with agencies and you point to that, they say, yeah, whatever. So that hasn't really moved the needle in terms of developing renewable energy explicitly. You don't get a different decision out of the RCA or DNR or DEC or whoever as a result of that energy policy. It's a aspirational, toothless statement, in statute at this point.
Thanks. So there's just a couple more real quick things, and then I know you've got to go, and we're going to move on, but very quickly. So, so one question is about really the cost for an IPP to connect to the grid, in particular with regard to the Juniper Creek project, and that the cost and process to actually connect to the grid was a pretty big challenge. Could you address that? I think you already did talk a little bit about transmission issues, but do you mind just quickly mentioning that?
Yeah. So most of these projects, like I said, they connect at the distribution level. So Juniper Creek, part of that interconnection cost is you've got a bunch of utility mandated switchgear to enable utility control of the project. Make sure that the utility assets, the distribution lines and so on are safe. By merit of whatever the project might do. You also have interconnection studies and stuff like that you have to pay for. So those are really project specific things. They're necessary costs for the safety and integrity of the system. But they are part of that development cost. And for a small project, they can be pretty profound costs.
Thank you. And thanks a lot for your time, Joel. I know that you're really busy today, so thanks for making yourself available. Thanks for delaying your other meeting for a few minutes. And we really appreciate your time.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I hope the other presentations today are super fun.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
thank you. All right. So next we have Brian Hickey up, and so this is pretty timely because there's been a lot of discussion here in the Q&A around Bradley Lake. So I'm hoping, Brian, that you can pinch hit on a couple of answers to these as well. But Brian represents the Bradley Project Management Committee, and one of the things that we were really hoping to do with regard to this seminar series or this symposium series is really to provide information on things that can help the task force perform its work in terms of thinking about future options, not just around project development, but also the way we're structuring things. And so one of the things that I found really interesting, and a lot of this dialogue in the chat here in the previous presentation sort of sets up nicely, is really the way the Bradley Lake project came about. The management structure, how we pulled together the state along with all the Railbelt utilities to sort of work collaboratively to see this project move forward. And a big part of that was around this formation of this entity, the BPMC that Brian is representing here today. And so we've asked him to kind of join us, not necessarily to talk about the nuts and bolts of the Bradley project, but a little bit more generally about how that project came about and how that might provide lessons learned, not just for hydro, but like how we might develop large-scale projects that benefit more than just one utility jurisdiction, at a time. So, Brian, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Let me share my screen here. So, are you guys seeing my?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Okay. Let me, I'll just go ahead. Thank you all for inviting me to speak, give you a little bit of insight into the Bradley Lake project, and mostly about the Bradley Lake governance structure and how it's a cooperative governance structure that includes all of the utilities in the rail belt and the state of Alaska as doing business as Alaska Energy Authority. Let me see here. There we go. Just a little background on the hydroelectric project. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's 120 megawatt or 120 MVA project. It's what's called a vertical shaft high head Pelton turbine. That's a technical term, but it's different than a lot of different than the other hydro projects, large hydro projects, Cooper and Eklutna, in that it's a kinetic energy machine as opposed to a potential energy machine. So it has a very high pressure jet of water that spins a wheel called a runner. It's a lake and penstock, as Joel alluded to. It has storage. It's a 125-foot dam. There's a 3.5 mile tunnel, mostly rock, and it's steel line near the bottom. It's about 11 feet in diameter, and it generates around 400 gigawatt hours of energy. To put that in perspective, Pre-pandemic, the rail belt was consuming about 4,800 gigawatt hours of energy. I think in 2021, we were at 4,400. So the pandemic took a bite out of that, but I believe it's starting to climb back up. Recently, we constructed the Battle Creek diversion, which added about 43 gigawatt hours to the project. And we're looking at the Dixon diversion, which is would be a significant increase. But the actual gigawatt hour totals for that haven't been calculated yet. They've been estimated but not calculated. It includes transmission assets, which a lot of folks don't understand or don't know. There's a static VAR compensator located just north of Soldotna on the Kenai Peninsula, and another static VAR compensator located at Dave's Creek near Cooper Landing. Those are devices that are used to maximize the ability to transfer energy off the Kenai, Bradley Lake energy off the Kenai into the northern participants. It also has two transmission line segments, the transmission line from Bradley to Bradley Junction, as well as a section of transmission line that was recently acquired from Homer Electric that runs from essentially Soldotna to Quartz Creek. There's a little difference between Soldotna and Sterling, but it's essentially Soldotna to Quartz Creek. And then the required project work that's under construction now, which will be the battery that's all portions of the battery that are already installed on the Kenai and that are being installed in the central region and are under planning and development in the northern region up by Fairbanks. Little technical background, due to the tunnel pressure constraints and what we call the water start time, Bradley is a very slow machine in responding to under frequency events. Its theoretical fastest response is 90 seconds, but generally it takes a number of minutes for it to go from 0 to full out. However, going the other direction, when you're actually trying to control an over frequency event, it is the fastest machine on the rail belt due to the construction of the dividers within the turbine pit. So it can go from full output to 0 in about 2 seconds. And that has caused some of the challenges related to Bradley Lake that the rail belt's experienced over the last few years. So moving on from that to talk a little bit about the organizational structure of it. It's a bit of history. I'm watching my clock here. You know, the Bradley Lake project was, they were identified in the early 1900s by the federal government when they inventoried the purchase of Alaska from the Russians. The Bureau of Reclamation did work on it in 1955. The state took over the application for Bradley, I believe in the early 1980s, 82, I believe it was. And then the actual construction, the funding of the project the state brought it forward in the mid 80s. And for those of you who were here then, you remember that was a time when the economy collapsed. Oil went from sort of $40 a barrel to $7 a barrel. And that was right about the time Bradley was in the legislature. The project had been approved, but the interties to connect it to the grid had not been. And there was concern that if they delayed the project at all, the project would fail. The utilities were hesitant to sign up for it because they didn't have access to it through the interties, which hadn't been funded by the state. And so the utilities got together with the state and formed the two secondary agreements. And I'll go over what these agreements are. So the primary agreement is the power sales agreement. The project was 50% state funded and 50% bond funded through a power revenue bond. And the state was to be paid back for their 50% funding at 0% interest after the power revenue bonds had been paid off. And so we still have outstanding bonds, so we haven't gone to paying off the state yet. But that's the funding structure behind it. 50% power revenue bonds, all those costs are paid for by the utilities on a project share basis. And then once there are no outstanding power revenue bonds on the project, we would start paying that average amount of money. Right now it's about 12.8 million. We would pay that to the state as a repayment of the 50% zero interest loan effectively that they gave us. Under the power sales agreement, you have two primary agreements, which are the agreement for sale of transmission capability called the capability agreement. And that gives the terms and conditions for pledging the Homer system to the project use. And then the agreement for the wheeling of electric power and related services called the services agreement. This are the terms and conditions for pledging the Chugach system for project use. And at the time, they called this a paper intertie. I think Dick Laresh or Bob Laresh was the head of APA back then, AEA. It was APA at the time. And that was the mechanism by which they got the utilities to agree to sign the take or pay agreement for Bradley Lake and got the project off of dead center at a time when it didn't look like the interties were going to be funded because of the collapse in the economy up here. Underneath those two secondary agreements, there are a number of sub-agreements. So there is the maintenance and operation agreement that Homer has with the BPMC to actually maintain the project assets. There are separate agreements for the maintenance and operations of the static VAR compensators. There's a dispatch agreement and protocols for how Chugach will dispatch the project. So there's a series of sub-agreements under these overarching agreements that kind of lay out who does what and when. The key stakeholders in the project are the state and the utilities. And the project is exempt from regulation under 4205-431. And that was a statutory exemption that was put in place primarily for three reasons, two reasons, I believe. One was that they felt at the time they were trying to move the project forward, and it was costing, delays were costing, they estimate about 10 to 15 million a year in 1985 dollars. And they felt like if they had to go through the APUC and then it ended up going to court, it would delay the project so long it would not succeed. And that was one of the reasons. The other reason was that at the time, bonds that were backed up by power revenue bonds that were backed up by payments from utilities that were regulated received a premium from bondholders, a premium charge, because there had been some issues in the lower 48 around the Washington water power, the nuke plants, where a regulatory commission disallowed costs and basically caused that Whoops project to collapse. So they took it out from under regulation of the RCA at the time to move the project forward. It also forms the power sales requires, the power sale agreement requires the formation of a project management committee, what we call the BPMC. And there are two fundamental duties the BPMC are called out in the power sales agreement. There is much more detail, but they fall under two categories. One is that the committee had to create rules of procedure by which they would operate the project, including such things as dispute resolution and decision authority on improvements to the project or required project work versus non-required project work. And so that those rules of procedure are contained in the bylaws of the project. And then subject to AEA approval, and AEA has a very special position on the BPMC. I'll talk about it in a minute. The AEA delegated the responsibility for operations and maintenance to the BPMC. So the project management committee actually operates and maintains the project through these series of sub-agreements and subcommittees. Under the roles and responsibilities, under the power sales agreement, and the utilities are known as the participants, and they are power purchasers, and they have take or pay contracts with the state. That means they pay for the output of project, whether it generates any electricity or not. So the risk is on the utilities that Bradley Lake will continue to produce power. The state, as the owner of the project, provides oversight and support for the BPMC's operations, is a member of the BPMC. And the BPMC then has these, the CEOs of the 5 utilities plus the director of the Energy Authority on that happens to be who I work for at this point in time. There's my 10 minutes, so I'll hurry up here. BPMC is responsible for improvement and operations and maintenance of the project. The decisions of the BPMC are made based on a majority plus 50% of load voting mechanism. However, AEA has a very unique role in that most topics require an affirmative vote of AEA. So they essentially have veto authority on most things other than a few limited things around how you schedule water and how you actually dispatch the project. And those are called out in more detail in the bylaws. And finally, all of the meetings of the project are covered under the state's Open Meetings Act, so the public is able, the meetings are noticed and the public is actually able to attend the meetings. Just to go a little bit more into the power delivery and transmission, I covered a little bit of this, but as I said, the services and capability agreement sort of formed a paper intertie that assured the purchasers that they would actually have at least single contingency access to the project. At that time, it was always thought that the state would eventually build the second intertie. And now here we are 32 years later, we're talking about doing it. We've come close a couple times, but we still haven't managed to do that. And that's, I always say on the Railbelt, temp is perm. And that's kind of where we're at on that. The capability agreement is a little different than the services agreement because there was a line section that goes from Bradley Junction to Soldotna that was constructed and owned by Homer and paid for on project proportion shares by the utilities. And through that payment, they purchased capability rights across the Homer system for Bradley Lake. And that is all detailed in great detail in the capability agreement. The services agreement is a little different because the Chugach system was already built out. And so it covers moving the power from Quartz Creek to Anchorage. Now, in the agreements, you'll see that it says Soldotna, and that was all that's kind of, Soldotna was the original terminus of the capability agreement, but once the wholesale power agreements between Chugach and the wholesale customers were terminated in 2013 and 14, that point was moved to Quartz Creek. So basically the capability agreement gets you to Soldotna. The state owns now the section from Soldotna to Quartz, and Chugach's system north of Quartz Creek, which is located near Cooper Landing, is how we move the power from that from the Kenai up to the various delivery points, which are, MLMP's old delivery point was Plant 2, MEA was delivered at Teelan, and so was Golden Valley. So those are the delivery points north. This agreement covers how that's done. It includes a calculation for what we call Bradley Lake wheeling. There are both firm and non-firm wheeling components. I don't believe anyone's ever purchased the firm, but it's in the agreement. It was a 15-year phase-in capped at 90% of Chugach's fully allocated transmission rate, less the Beluga to Point McKenzie lines. So the Bradley Trent wheeling rate is roughly 75% of the Chugach fully allocated rate because of the 90% cap plus excluding all the Beluga to Point Mac stuff. It also names Chugach as the project dispatcher, subject to review of their performance by the BPMC. And importantly, AEA is not signatory to either of those agreements. And finally, how do we price Bradley Lake Energy? It's strictly a cost-based resource. Basically, you total up the cost of the project. We budget that in advance. And then at the end of the year, we true up what the actuals were, and either the utilities pay more or we return money to them. And that's sort of all I've got on the Bradley Lake, and I would be happy to take any questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen here.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Brian. Just because we did have some of those questions on how the ownership was originally structured, I just was wondering if you could clarify one thing for me. I was under the impression that the bonds for Bradley Lake were paid off in 2021. Is that true? And then was there like an additional bond package that was approved for transmission and storage upgrades? That's
correct. So the original revenue bonds were paid off, and then the transmission line rebuild between Soldotna, so let's say Soldotna and Quartz Creek, which is the lossiest section of the line, and one of the reasons it's limited to 90 megawatt operation during normal is because it's a very lossy section. So the bonds were taken out we purchased that line from Homer, and we're rebuilding that line, and some of that bond that required project work. So those were determined required project work by the Department of Law, and so they become bonds of the project. And then those bonds, that bond, the most recent bond issue, I believe was December of last year, was $166.5 million, which the utilities are paying off. That goes into the cost of Bradley Lake Power and is paid off by the utilities over time.
So was that kind of part of the original plan, was that there could be these additional bonds? Like, is there going to be a plan to actually pay that back? Will we ever get to where we're paying back the state, or like what's the expectation moving forward?
I don't know that there are expectations on it, but required project work there's an entire section in the power sales agreement, and there's a methodology for determining how required project work is determined. And the BPMC has the authority to go through and do that. There's both required and non-required project work sections in the power sales agreement. So it was anticipated when the project was developed in the 1980s that this would happen. And I think what you'll see is at some point the generators will have to be rewound, and so we'll see how that all plays out.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. Curtis, did you have a question that you wanted to ask or comment?
No, I just want to make the point that even though the AEA bonded the $166 million, the work that is being done with those proceeds is owned by AEA, in essence, owned by the state. So even though the utilities are paying it back, and that the state has an ownership for that $166 million. So, you know, the state, as they own Bradley, they will own these upgrades also. So the state does get a benefit for that bonding package.
Yes, it's all required project work, so it's part of the project's cost. And as I noted earlier, you know, the project isn't just the dam and the lake and the powerhouse, its own transmission facilities up and down the rail belt throughout its history.
Great. Well, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that that background. I'm not really seeing any other questions here necessarily in the chat, but I do think that structure, it seems to me as an outsider that it has worked pretty well in terms of a mechanism for all of the interested parties to be working together and contributing productively to the management and continued operation of Bradley Lake as an important asset on the rail.
Yeah, it's been successful, and I think one of the things that the folks are looking at now is as a potential replicating that model for some of the work that we potentially will be doing on the transmission system over the next few years, not as a part of the Bradley Lake project per se, but as a separate entity modeled after the Bradley Lake, because it has been successful in that it's brought all the utilities together. It has well understood dispute resolution procedures. It has well understood operating procedures, and using that format as a framework may be a way for us to move to a more centralized and modern transmission system model. And so I think the folks, we're all looking at that right now, and mostly because it's been successful. You know, it's 32 years. We've had our ups and downs, but all in all, the utilities have all played together pretty well and have cooperated, and we have a successful project. So that might be a model moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting, Brian. And that was one of the reasons why we were hoping to have you present on this, because, you know, when we're sort of looking at these sorts of, like you're saying, governance models that have been successful, that we might be able to transition to other sort of large infrastructure investments that we might make in the future. And as you know, as Curtis just mentioned, the fact that what we're doing here is that this was really, there is state ownership of some of these assets that we're that we're sort of upgrading or updating, like that SQ line and things like that. The Soldotna Quartz Creek line, is that right? SQ line. And so I think that's actually a really interesting model. If there was to be future state investment, I'm curious, like, how you would envision, and I guess I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, so I realize this is like the Brian Hickey answer to this, but you know, that idea that the state, whether they loaned Bradley money or it really is looking like it was maybe a little bit of a grant of sorts. You know, it's maybe a little bit half a dozen to one discussion at this point in time, but that idea that maybe there's some kind of a an approach that does include loans and maybe some state investment, and however that looks, with some sort of a management structure, but with the idea of sort of having those new assets as state owned and making that more of like a public good, right? So we can kind of get away from any kind of congestion around the transmission assets as like sort of these private ownership models, and moving more towards sort of like a public good model for a transmission line. That might be something that that this sort of a model could help us move toward potentially. Would that be?
I think you're right there. I mean, you know, the payment to the state is a fiduciary responsibility of the project participants under their take or pay contract. There is the ability to, you know, to continue to, and they also have the requirement to improve the project and to maintain it. So to the degree that requires bonding, it does push that payback to the state out. But so that being said, I mean, it isn't a grant straightforward, but it certainly was a subsidy to the project in a sense. I do think that on a going forward basis, because it recognizes this unique role of the state as sort of they have veto power over most of the for assets they own. They have veto power over most of the decisions I think that model works really well because the utilities who actually are skilled at operating and maintaining the equipment are doing the operations and maintenance. And the state, in its fiduciary role as the owner, maintains the ability to, if the utilities get a little off the track, to bring them back and take care of the assets that the state owns. I think it's a unique model in that way. And I think it probably, it seems to me it's been successful. So I think we'll continue to explore that from some of the investment potentially in transmission, for example.
Without opening up a can of worms, I'm actually just kind of curious if those bonds were all paid back, and then that initial investment from the state, we started to make progress on paying that back. Who would make decisions? Like, what would happen with that funding? Would that go back to back into the state budget, and the legislature would have some authority over how to reallocate that?
It's kind of an interesting. In the power sales agreement, there were two entities contemplated. One was called the Railbelt Electric Council, which at the time the power sales agreement was drafted was made up of a board member, a legislator, and a CEO from each of the Railbelt utilities. That group sort of disbanded in the 80s. If you go back, and I've gone back and reviewed the legislative records from that time, and there were some folks who were still around. And Joyce Murphy was from Chugach, and Rick Halford, and there were some guys who were still around who were on that committee. That disbanded, but that group was supposed to have what was called the Railbelt Energy Fund, which was set up to build transmission in the rail belt. Now, the challenge, I think, with that is no legislature can bind a future legislature. So in effect, it goes back to the general fund, but the intent in the power sales agreement was that this joint utility legislative committee would fund the Railbelt Energy Fund, and those funds would be used to build the interties. Now, that all fell apart in the 80s when the economy collapsed, and it's never been re-upped. And I know that, one legislature can't bind another, so it had no binding authority, but it was the intent at the time. And all of that language is in the power sales agreement if you read it.
Great. Thanks for indulging me on going down that rabbit hole. I find this stuff to be really interesting. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate your time, and I am sure that we will be in touch with you as we continue to work on some of these things. You provided a lot of really important information today, and really appreciate your hard work.
Great, thank you, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of the committee. I'm not sure that's what I'm doing here. So, thanks a lot.
Feels that way sometimes, right?
Yeah. Have a great day, y'all. Bye.
Thanks. And Brian, are you going to be able to stick around in case there's some questions at the end as well? Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yep, I'll be on. Thank you.
All right. And with that being said, I think we're going to turn it over to Brian Carey, who, Brian, I think of you as the hydropower program manager for AEA, but I think that your title is actually the director of owned assets for the Alaska Energy Authority, and also Wayne Dyuk, who's the former Susitna Wantana project manager who retired from AEA in about 2016, but has continued to remain pretty active in developing hydropower projects. And so the two of you together are going to be presenting on Susitna, today's outlook, and current and upcoming projects. So thank you, Brian and Wayne. I think, Brian, you're going to go first, but we'll turn the floor over to the two of you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, slides. I think Brittany has the slides. Okay, looks a little bit strange, but let's move forward to the first slide. Okay, so we'll be talking about Bradley projects and the development of them. I just got the first slide about Bradley Lake. You've already heard about how it's funded by AEA and the utilities. It is the largest hydroelectric project in the state. It's about 25% of the energy generated of all the hydro projects in the state. And it's averaging around 400,000 megawatt hours. And that was, the Battle Creek water is not affecting that yet. And so it is increasing at this point, and probably in the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to be seeing the annual average of more 430 to 450. And I will say on average, the energy, depending on the year with rainfall and sun, it could drop down to as much as 300, or it could be greater than 500,000. So it's large difference in there. One of the big differences between Bradley and some of the small projects that have been mentioned by Joel would be that Bradley is licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and it adds on time and adds on cost for both the licensing and during the operation. It's, I'll say, regulated much more so. The other difference between Bradley and the other projects is it's much more for storage hydro, and the storage water is much more valuable to utilities than what the run river type projects are, because they can carry it into wintertime and they can optimize the use of the water from Bradley with all their other generation resources to lower the cost of energy for everyone. So maybe next slide. Okay, Battle Creek project, we started around 2010 with the whole process, and it was completed and came online in July of 2020. Essentially, it's diverted what would be the West Fork of the Upper Battle Creek, most of the water over to Bradley Lake, and it was funded by the state, and but most of the funding came across from the Railbelt utilities, and it goes through a 2-mile pipe. You can see the diversion dam here. For the Dixon diversion dam, the dam would be about the same size. And so what you're seeing here is about the same size as what you'd get out of the Dixon. Annual energy was estimated at about 37,000 megawatt hours. At this point, last year is actually much better than that. Last year is about 43 or 44,000 megawatt hours. So it's actually pretty low cost energy too when it's coming in. Once it's in the lake, it just goes through the Bradley Lake powerhouse. Next slide. So development of the project, pretty much we started about 2010, and for the first 2 or 3 years did some fisheries type studies, geotechnical studies, and consulted with the agencies. And then at that point, we also, the cost was looking like it was going to be too high of a cost. And so we re-looked at how the project would be constructed to lower cost. And you also have to do a draft license amendment, final license amendment. And we ended up turning in the license amendment to FERC in 2015. We received the final environmental assessment and the license amendment both in 2016. And in 2017, we did the financing for the project, which had to be where the utilities agree on it. And one thing too on the financing is it wasn't one bond package. For Battle Creek, there's actually 3 different financing packages that were put together where we could take advantage of various tax credits or other opportunities. And I believe the original Bradley bonds, there's about 8 bonds that Bradley was actually financed with. So it's not one finance type thing. It's multiple bonding packages put together. So the contractor started work in 2018 and it was finished in July of 2020. Next slide. So now we're looking at the next large project, which would be the Dixon diversion. This glacier here is located about 5 miles from Bradley, and it's around 20 square miles or give or take. So next slide. What we would be doing is, you can see this where the Dixon Glacier is, and there's a line that goes here to Bradley Lake. We would actually do a tunnel that would take the outflow water from the Dixon Glacier and bring it into Bradley Lake. And it's adding more gas to the gas tank for what would be the Bradley powerhouse. It would also be the largest renewable energy project in Alaska since Bradley was built in 1991. We're looking at around 150 to 200,000 megawatt hours, and that's fairly substantial. Next slide. So these coastal mountains are all, I don't know, the rainforest down lower. You got 20 square miles. This area at this elevation receives more than 100 inches of precipitation per year. And the glaciers are melting. We know that. And based on what we've done with LIDAR or otherwise, we know over the last 8 years or so that the annual average is about 94,000 acre feet of water coming out because of ice melt. And so you add them together and you end up with about 200,000 acre feet of water a year, which for Bradley, that will actually be close to 200,000 megawatt hours. Next slide. So the project would be is you've got the tunnel, which is 4.7 miles to go from the diversion dam or to Bradley Lake. And once it's at Bradley Lake, it'll go through the powerhouse. But because of the storage hydro is way more valuable to the utilities for various reasons, we would also, the amount of water would be cause Bradley Lake to continually spill during the summer. And we don't want to spill because we lose water. So as part of the project, we would raise the dam at Bradley Lake. There's, we have options for raising it up to 28 feet. However, we might very well just do a raise of 14 or 15 feet. It's still to be determined what would be the best elevation to raise it to. And that's going to be storing a lot more water for the wintertime and for usage of economizing. And one of the area that's important on this is when you're storing the water, it's relatively low cost energy storage. So I'll just mention that the new battery that's going to be built in Anchorage for 70 megawatt hours is close to $70 million. Whereas this, once it fills full, that if you raise it 14 feet, it's going to cost around $30 million, and you're gaining storage of about 55,000 acre feet of water, which is maybe 55,000 megawatt hours of storage. And so it's actually a relatively cheap battery once you build it. And the entire project, which should be both Bradley and Dixon diversion, is on state land. So next slide. So I mentioned about how large the project would be. You can kind of see a comparison here. You see Bradley Lake right now around 400,000. You've got Dixon diversion. We had on this slide from a year ago, 160, and then you've got Fire Island, and it looks like it kind of cut off the solar part too. But most of this slide came from Chugach, and I'm not really sure what happened to the bottom part of the slide. But it's just a good comparison to see how big it is. Next slide. So having the storage, it's got a lot of value. I mentioned energy. You could use the water just as a, I'll say, base wise and just keep on running it, but that's not how it's actually has the most value. It's got a lot more value with running it for the utilities to displace peaking plants in terms of when they're using up too much gas, or they could use it to regulate if they have non-dispatchable renewable projects. And since you're not going to be building any new powerhouse, you're taking the existing powerhouse and you're increasing the capacity factor of the existing powerhouse so that you're better using your existing assets. And I mentioned about the long duration energy storage with the higher dam, and that's relatively cheap at a low cost. The other part about this, we don't have in the cost estimates at the time being a new turbine generator, but we could add a new turbine generator at Bradley if we wanted to in the future to better use this energy for peaking purposes. So that could always be an option at a future time. Next slide. So kind of the next steps. And this year, what we're doing is we're verifying the energy we're doing monthly discharge measurements, and we've got stage gauges. And as long as we're out there at the river, they're taking various water quality measures. And then this fall, what we're going to be doing is we're meeting together a bunch of engineers and utility people and working on optimizing the facilities, because we tend to believe that we do not need a road to go up to the glacier or the diversion here. And by getting rid of the road, we believe that we can be cutting the cost by a very significant amount of money. And along with that, we're also doing a little bit of additional geologic site review, because the main cost for this project is going to be doing the tunnel. And so by gathering a little bit more of the geologic information right now and what we could do perhaps next year, then we're going to be able to narrow in that cost estimate for what the tunnel would be. Then once we've done that, and we are at the end of this fall, we would be having a revised in terms of the energy and revised what the cost amount would be for the project. Then later this winter, probably January or so, we'd do additional consultation with the agencies in terms of what studies are required. And along with consultation with the agencies, other groups or other stakeholders would certainly be putting their input in terms of what projects, studies or otherwise need to be done. And then in 2024, we would be going off and proceeding forward with the various studies, being environmental or more engineering related, such as geotechnical or drilling. So next slide. So I mentioned about this is part of the, this is regulated by FERC. We did file an amendment last year, and I have as 2023 to 2025. You generally do about 2 years of studies, and so we'd be able to have our second year of studies finishing up in 2025. And then 2026 and 27, we would end up doing the draft and final amendment to FERC and put those forward, and hopefully get a response back from FERC. That would be good. And perhaps in 2028 do the bid, and then construction in 2028 or 9, depending on when you get do the bid and when you get the information back. And seasonality too plays into this. So in general, a lot of these large projects like that are going to take about 10 years. And it can also depend on what the season is. That's going to affect different things or not. So I think let's go forward to the next slide. Oh, and I just wanted to kind of mention there was a part about Godwin. Godwin is similar to Dixon for a couple of reasons why. In terms of with the melting the glacier and the coastal mountains, it's the nice part about Godwin though is relatively close to Seward. And so that to go to the substation is only a couple of miles. And right now, between what your annual precip is plus what could be ice melt, depending on how it gets verified, it may be up to 120,000 acre feet. And so by the time you convert to megawatt hours, it still could be 100,000 megawatt hour type of project. So a utility scale project. Next slide. One of the things I wanted to mention about it though was you could build it a couple different ways. One is that you do your intake downstream the lake. And if you do it downstream the lake, the entire project would be on state land, and it'd be likely to be a non-FERC project. And so from that standpoint, it's potentially you could do the project a year or two quicker than otherwise. Whereas if you do the intake up at the lake, it's of more value to the utilities because they would have more ability to, it would not be run a river, but they could actually store a limited amount of water for some regulating. But at the same time, why it's more valuable to do it there, and they would also gain some head, it's going to take them longer for the whole FERC process to play out, and there'll be some additional cost in regards to studies. So Chugach Electric is doing work on this, and I'm just going to figure that if it all pans out, if the energy numbers and costs look good, then it could be online in 10 years or less. So next slide. Oh, I guess that's it. So I'm good for questions, or go to Wayne next.
I don't see any questions yet. So if you want to just go ahead and we can go to Wayne, and then we can encourage folks. If you have questions, start dropping them in the chat there. So thanks, Brian.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Brian and Gwen, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the Susitna-Watana, project. So, Brittany, if you don't mind putting up the first and second slides. Next slide, please. So, Susitna has a very long history. Actually, the project has been on the thought process for over 100 years, but the real first major studies were conducted in the 1950s by the Bureau of Reclamation. And then in the 1980s, the Alaska, Power Authority at that time conducted a lot of studies. And around 1986, as I think Brian Hickey mentioned, the price of oil went to about $7 a barrel, and that was the end of the project for the time being. But in 2010, had the renewable energy goal of 50% by 2025, and so Susitna was, resurrected. And in 2011, the Alaska legislature authorized the project, and studies began in 2012. So in the 90s, we conducted quite a few studies, and then in the 2012 to 2016 period, a lot of additional studies. And what happened, there is that the results that we had, yes, we had some new findings, but I think
Uh-oh, Wayne. Can you still hear us? Okay, can folks hear me? Is it me or Wayne?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay.
Yeah, Wayne just froze up. He locked up completely. Maybe he logs back in.
Okay, that makes me feel better. I thought it was me for a second. Brian Carey, we still have you here?
Yes.
I don't know if you could maybe, while hopefully Wayne logs back in, do you want to just kind of go over this slide? Would that be possible? Could you kind of, maybe we're getting him back here.
Okay.
So, and I'm gonna, I'm gonna take my picture off because that might have made me unstable here. So I listened for 2 hours, hour and a half, and no problems. And all of a sudden I get to present and we have a problem.
Just leave your video off and we're good. Thanks.
Okay. So did you get through to the part where we went into abeyance here? And if so, then when can you let me know where I lost you? Because I wasn't sure.
I don't think we made it quite that far, but
okay, well, I'll just quickly summarize then. Okay. So we did lots of studies in the 80s and the last 4 years. In those studies, essentially, we got new information, but a lot of the fun information that we collected in the 1980s was verified in the 2012 to 2016 period. But because the price of oil, as was mentioned by Brian Hickey, went to $7, because of, let me back off, for various reasons, we put the product in abeyance in 2017, and then was rescinded in 2019. But not much has happened to the project since then. So if we can go to the next slide. So why would we want to build the Susitna-Watana project? There's a number of reasons. The first one is that the project would serve 80% of the state's population. There'd be a lot of jobs created during construction, with 1,000 of them during the peak part of construction. And, as was mentioned, I think by Joel, once you get these projects built, you have stable electricity rates, last 100 years. Certainly the New York Power Authority on their Niagara and St. Lawrence projects, these projects have been in operation for, getting close to 100 years. Rates then were like 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and they're still around 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Also, as part of this, process, you would have long-term, diversification of our energy resources in Alaska. And I think, as we've heard today from every speaker, that hydro is a clean and reliable, energy source. One really nice advantage of the Susitna project would be that it would promote the integration of the variable power resources that Joel was talking about. So we could add that 100 megawatts of hydro into the system. We could add, wind, and we could add even, summertime solar or any other, variable sources of power, and be able to, run the system very efficiently. Also, we could reduce the carbon dioxide emissions by more than 100 million tons per year, and that's 250,000, cars. And then, lastly, I would say that we can't meet the governor's goal of 30% sustainable by 2030, but we could certainly go a long ways to meeting that 80% by 2040 if Susitna was built. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the the project. This slide shows the location of the project relative to the Anchorage and Fairbanks area. It's it's at River Mile 184 on the Susitna River, and it's about 87 miles, north of Talkeetna. One of the key things of the project is it's about 22 to 32 river miles upstream from Devil's Canyon, and Devil's Canyon is really an impediment to all but the hardiest anadromous fish. Getting up, there's only about 4 or 5 dozen anadromous fish that get upstream of Devil's Canyon, annually. So the product would provide a lot of energy on the order of 2,600 gigawatt hours, or 26,000 or 2.6 million megawatt hours. So it's an awful lot of energy. As Brian had talked about, for Bradley, this would be under the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and obviously we would have a fairly long life of this product, particularly since it's glacially fed. Next slide, please. So where do we need to go to move this project along? The first thing is the governor and the legislature would have to reinitiate the FERC process, and have discussions with FERC staff to see what's necessary. Another important component of this would be to work very closely with the Alaska Native landowners. They're to making this work, and similarly, the utilities are critical in making the project work, because they're going to be the off-takers of the power. The construction cost on the previous page, it was about a little under $6 billion, so it's probably around $6 billion. When we were looking at the project recently, we were looking to finance half the project with rural utility services money. I still think that's a very viable approach, and then government obligation bonds the other half. So that would need to be revisited along with the cost, and then engaging the public, providing facts, educating the public on facts about the project, not hearsay, but on facts. And then the last major step would be to file a license application for the project. Next slide. So this is a little outdated, this slide, but I think you can get the gist of it. As Joel said, when you build a hydropower project, your costs might be initially high, but they really don't increase. Most of your costs are related to the capital costs, and O&M is typically a small fraction. So the blue line that you see here is pretty typical of what you'd see for every hydro, and what we were looking at for Susitna. pretty stable costs. When you pay off the bonds, then the project costs go down. Probably wouldn't be as much as here, but experience in other large projects shows that the costs go down after the project is paid off, but there's still associated costs, increased capital costs for replacing parts, etc. But this is the standard type of curve that you would see. And then the black line here, natural gas power costs, and a lot of this is dependent upon getting natural gas from Cook Inlet, what's happening, and probably that black line is even higher today than projecting just a few years ago. And what you see at the beginning of this slide is that the blue line is a little bit higher than the black line, and from a ratepayer's perspective, they don't want to pay more at the early part, even though they would pay less at the latter part. So that's obviously a key thing that needs to be worked out. But this slide, the Susitna-Wetana costs and the natural gas power costs should be revisited as part of this, next steps to make sure that the project remains, economic. Next slide. So, what are the real key takeaways, for this, project? First, in terms of power cost certainty, once the product is built, you really know what your costs are going to be, and you won't be subject to any price hikes in fuels. So that's one really key takeaway to a product like Susitna. And as I mentioned with respect to the last slide, even in the early years, it's competitive with natural gas, maybe a little bit higher, but in the long term, certainly going to be a lower cost. And then more than doubles the current amount of Alaska's renewable energy. And if you compare like Bradley Lake, for example, the 400,000 megawatt hours that Brian was talking about, Susitna produces actually more than 6 times that amount of energy. So it's a lot of energy that could really help the grid. And it would enhance our energy security into the future. And another important one, as I mentioned, it allows other renewables to come into the system and not cause any instabilities. And I think that's it. Next slide. That's it. So I guess we can open it up for questions.
Thanks, Wayne. I appreciate it. And I don't know if we want to try using your camera again, but but at least we got through that. So thanks. I think that there are some questions, or one that we have here from Alan Mitchell is like, to what extent AEA might do comparisons of the return economics, basically, of these kinds of hydro projects, including Susitna, in comparison to other sorts of investments that might be made using sort of scarce state resources, including things like wind and solar, is the question that we have here. And Brian, feel free to jump in as well if you want to.
Yeah, I think that's more of a Brian question. When it looks at all the other projects, how AEA would consider that.
Well, I'll say in terms of what AEA, we don't have really much in the way of discretionary funding. So we don't go out and do comparison of hydro versus wind versus solar. It would have to be the governor or legislators would have to tell us to do a comparison. And so I think doing a comparison is going to be going back down to Juneau. If they determine that there's to be a comparison, then who is to do the comparison?
And Brian, just to kind of follow up on that, so now how would this fit into like an integrated resource plan that that the Railbelt Reliability Council is supposed to engage in a couple of years here, or hopefully sooner? Do you know?
Well, the integrated resource plan is going to be much more comparing projects, and then actually a bit of the transmission have in there, come up with a plan for the future. And based on what project proponents say for the cost of the different projects, then various projects will appear in the plan for based on the cost of energy, or not only cost of energy, but let's just say how well they fit in with the plan, because maybe solar, maybe it's the lowest cost, but you can't just go off and build 1,000 megawatts of solar, because that's still not going to do you anything in January. And so from that standpoint, all the generation is going to be cost, but it also has to be how well it fits in the overall plan. And so the various projects as they move forward, I don't think that any one generation source will cover everything. And so you're going to have to end up with a diversified portfolio of projects that come up with the energy for the integrated resource plan.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Brian Hickey, I welcome you to please turn your camera on and be part of this conversation too. We've got a few minutes left. And I am interested in these kinds of conversations, because I completely agree with you, Brian, that there is sort of a diverse portfolio of solutions that we're going to need, and that there's probably not too many people that think that solar alone is going to be powering our grid in December. But I am curious, like, how we think about state investments in things, right? Whether it's state investment in maybe transmission assets or some of these larger projects versus, where the private sector comes in, whether it's some of the small IPPs that Joel was talking about, or whether that is, things like the solar farm that Jen Miller's been working on. How do we kind of look at how do we maximize the use of state investment and know that that's the best bang for our buck when you're looking at it in the context of federal opportunities, private sector, and just basically benefiting consumers both on the Railbelt, but then Alaska more generally. So,
Gwen, if I could jump in there, I think an interesting a framework that we need to look at this in is you really have to bifurcate the generation world into variable resources and dispatchable resources. And having hydroelectric storage allows you to integrate more over from a long-term regulation basis. Not short-term regulation has to be done by batteries. These hydro projects aren't fast enough in this system to do short-term regulation, but long-term seasonal storage, by building hydro reservoirs, you actually enable larger quantities of variable resources to be brought online. I think Brian Carey brought that up earlier. And so I think you have to look at it in that framework. The variable seasonal storage and transmission are more public good type products that are necessary to allow the private sector to come in and do independent small IPP projects that are more variable resources. Wind, solar, run-of-river hydro. So I think you kind of want to look at I would look at state investment of public good assets and let the private sector figure out the best way to bring on some of these smaller, and the utilities can do some of that too, but the private sector's in many ways more nimble and have different financing sources. So there's some combination of utility IPP investment in in that area of the generation. But I think these public good products like storage, the storage aspect of hydro, it's a dispatchable resource, but it's also a storage resource. And as well as, having adequate transmission capability to move power reliably and resiliently from one end to the other. So.
Thanks. And I don't know if you were reading off of the Q&A here, but I think that you addressed one of Andrew McDonald's questions here about.
I was not,
exactly
so we must think alike.
Good job addressing that. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say, Brian, is that that really with sort of public resources, we really want to invest in things that create the most flexibility and that allow us to then access private sector to sort of be able to enter into the market and kind of fill it out. But we're sort of investing in ways to kind of firm up and kind of, like you're saying, those variable resources versus dispatchable resources, making sure that we have a reliable supply of power on the grid, whether it's December or whether it's July, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Gwen, if I could just jump in here for a second and maybe add to what Brian was talking about in terms of resources versus private resources. I can tell you that in terms of renewable energy, there are a lot of private entities out that would be interested in financing a large storage project as well. So I wouldn't limit it just to the the run-of-river type projects, but I think the storage projects that might be out there, Susitna, to some extent Bradley, I guess, and any other storage product that's out there. I can tell you from working with some of these developers that they would be very anxious to come to Alaska and invest some money there.
Thanks, Wayne. I really appreciate that. And actually that brings up something I may have missed if you did mention this. What are the opportunities at the federal level in terms of actually funding or financing with regard to some of the incentives that are out there right now for something like a Susitna?
Well, there's a lot of money out there. I think I just heard yesterday that based on the recent legislation that was enacted, DOE has identified $7 billion worth of investment that's going to be undertaken in conjunction with some of the monies that have been allocated by Congress. And so when you look at $7 billion, that's a lot of money. So I think we would have to look at, probably miss some windows of opportunity for projects like Dixon and Susitna, but I believe there's a huge push towards the renewable energy and getting us there. And I don't think we've heard the last of it from Congress, but I don't know that we're in line to get some of the $550 billion that's allocated, because I think a lot of that letters of intent were required in June for that, and you really had to have your project online by November of 2021. But I think on a going forward basis, there are going to be opportunities, and I would recommend meeting with the congressional delegation, talking to them about what specific in mind, because I think they could be hugely valuable for this task force in planning projects going forward.
Brian, I know that you've been leading a lot of the work with the Railbelt utilities on these GRIP applications that have been more oriented towards transmission and storage. Have you also been looking at additional opportunities for federal support for hydroelectric in Alaska?
We did. We submitted lengthy comments on the hydro efficiency. I think they had about $900 million for hydro efficiency, although that turned out to not be something that really applied to our system. It was really more about rewinding generators and things that our hydro resources, they've either recently been rewound or they aren't ready to be rewound yet. So that was one bucket of money there. Under the and that's pretty much what I believe is out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. However, under the Inflation Reduction Act and the direct pay provisions from the ITC or PTC tax credits, I think there might be an opportunity for a project like Susitna, Watana, Dixon, or Godwin Creek. I do know that those at the currently that money has to be spent within, I believe, 8 years. And so, that time frame is fairly short for the project of the magnitude that we're talking about here, but potentially there may be a way to recover some of the costs to complete the licensing, which I'm not sure, Brian Carey, what we're looking at nowadays for that, but I've always heard it was a couple $100 million to complete the license. So there are opportunities. We haven't moved beyond that. We're just sort of working on the IRA and the new era funding sources around the Healy 2 Shovel Creek wind farm thing. So from a hydro perspective, I also know that there's a big chunk of money, I believe it's $27 billion going to the EPA. And those funds and how that's going to work out hasn't been articulated by the EPA yet. So there may be something there, right? But I don't know that. So, there's more to come. I mean, I know what I have found, I've been, to Wayne's point, we've been deeply engaged with the delegation and in DC, and things are happening. The agencies are writing these regulations as on the fly, trying to get this money out the door. So it kind of changes on a weekly or monthly basis.
Tracking that on for the purpose of some of these larger public benefit infrastructure projects. Brian Carey, is that AEA? Brian Hickey, is that you with BPMC? Who is it? The governor's office? Who's working on that?
I think, I'm doing a lot for the Railbelt utilities, but Andrew Jensen, I'm coordinating with Andrew Jensen, who's the state infrastructure coordinator. And I believe he coordinates with Brian Carey. So we have sort of a loose, I call it trifecta of folks who are trying to stay ahead of this, but it's definitely a moving target.
Thank you. Brian Carey, did you want to add anything to any of those comments?
Oh, no, it's Alaska Energy Authority, consults and talks to the governor's office quite a bit. I did want to mention in regards to finance and public money or not, that area, we're not going to get to Dixon financing for 4 or 5 years. And interest rates go up and down in 1 year by substantial amounts. You could just look at what has happened during the last year. And if the US goes in more of a recession, then rates drop considerably. So what the rates are right now is not so important. It's going to be what the rates are in 5 years, but also what packages are out there for, be it tax credits or otherwise, that Congress may have. So it's really hard to say right now what the economics will be when we do the financing in 5 years. And if there's any state financing at that point, and if it's all utility financing. But if it's all utility financing, if there's any state financing that occurs, it reduces down what the ratepayer is paying, directly, because there's no profit, because it's not a profit. The utilities are nonprofit, so that any savings goes back directly to the ratepayers.
Yeah, and Brian, if I could just add on to that, when we looked at Susitna-Wautanah, the rates were a lot lower than they are today. But that's one of the beauties of getting a license. You have 10 years to start construction, and you can look at timing for finance. You don't necessarily have to finance everything in 1 year. You could finance it over a number of years, and look at financing leveraging, if you like. Let me just also mention while I'm chatting here that I was on a call this morning with Joe Baden of the Rural Utility Service, and he was talking about grant and how the RUS has funded Alaska projects over the years, and they have 10 million, I think, in grant monies annually that they're distributing. And I think that for those run of river projects that we were talking about earlier, that would be a great source to be looking at. And I would agree with you, Gwen, that somebody really needs to take leadership in looking at how can that money come to Alaska. Since he specifically spoke about Alaska in the call this morning.
Thanks, Wayne. And I just want to acknowledge that Andrew Jensen was very quick to drop into the chat here that he is not the infrastructure coordinator, that it is Shireen Crosby in the governor's office. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Thanks. That was my mistake. He took.
No,
sorry.
he's working closely with the task force on energy now.
Energy, right? He's the energy coordinator.
The new all things energy is Andrew's new theme. So, and so I'm just going to change track a little bit. This is a really interesting, but getting back a little bit more on an interesting kind of technical question here. Andrew McDonnell, he says that Brian Carey, you mentioned the opportunity for a new. Well, actually, I don't know which Brian this was.
It is me.
Yeah.
I was kind of typing an answer.
Yeah, okay, no. If you can go ahead and address
Okay.
this, but I don't know that everyone can see it. So go ahead and just explain what the question is if you've seen it here.
All right, the question is there an option to turn Bradley into a pumped hydro facility, store cheap wind, solar, and provide supporting grid service? There's a couple of opportunities depending on whether they're economically or not. One is, the short way is you could always run Bradley similar to how Terra Lake is run with the wind down in Kodiak. And so when the wind blows, you cut back on the hydro. And when the wind's not blowing, then you run the hydro more. And so you don't have enough water for year-round usage. And so by cutting back on the hydro when the wind is blowing, you're saving water for more important time periods. However, for pump storage, you don't have an opportunity to use the Bradley power plant because that's at sea level and there's no basin. You don't want to put up salt water going back up to Bradley Lake. However, there's a upper basin to Battle Creek that you could put a dam across there. And there's around a 900-foot drop from that upper basin down to Bradley Lake. And so you'd put another power plant in on the shore of Bradley Lake. And that power plant then could, generate power when you want, or pump water back up to Battle Creek at the headwaters of Battle Creek. And so that the nice part about it is it's still all within the project on state land. There'd be very little permitting to do with it. And Bradley Lake does not have any fish. And so at the standpoint of the water you having go back up and down is there's no fish issues, and you could generate power that way. It just depends on if it's worth it.
Thanks, Brian. And actually, Brian, Carrie, one other point that I had hoped that you would just touch on quickly, and this may be to wrap us up here, but we've been talking a lot about how these kinds of state investments can help reduce the cost of energy for Railbelt consumers. I'm also just kind of interested in just quickly touching on the fact that historically, at least, we've really used these kinds of opportunities for state investment, where we've looked at things like the 4-dam pool investment by the state, as also like sort of a quid pro quo, where we really started or invested in the endowment for the power cost equalization program. So we're looking at mechanisms where we may be able to sort of distribute some of these benefits elsewhere. And also that the PCE program, if we are able to bring down rates on the Railbelt, those essentially do kind of trickle down to a statewide impact, because it impacts that base rate and the formula calculation for the PCE program. So I don't know if you want to just touch on that. I'm always hesitant to spend too much time talking about Railbelt issues and not acknowledging that this task force does have a statewide mission.
Well, certainly the cost of power on the Railbelt affects statewide, because the PCE rate that non-Railbelt areas receive is based on an average of what you have on the Railbelt and the Juneau area. So if you lower the cost of power on the Railbelt, or you hold it steady and level for a bit of time, it's going to affect what, even if the power cost out in the rural areas is increasing, they're able to receive a larger PCE subsidy if the Railbelt is held steady or drops. And so it does affect the power cost throughout Alaska, whatever happens on the Railbelt.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. And with that being said, I think we'll wrap up today. I just want to quickly mention that that we're still working on the precise agenda for next week. But one of the things that we'll be sharing is a public perception poll that we've done on Alaska energy, on technologies and on specific energy projects that was recently conducted on a statewide basis. I think it has some really interesting results that I'd like to share with the task force. And I think we're also looking at potentially digging a little bit into nuclear energy, which is not something we talked about today, but another technology that has the potential to provide baseload power on the Railbelt or in some of our rural communities. And so I think that that's probably what you're going to be seeing for next week. Stay tuned on that. And with that being said, I'd also like to thank Brittany and Erica for helping organize and coordinate the symposium series, and to all 3 and 4, if we count Joel, of our speakers for today. So thanks very much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Okay.